In the late summer of 1942, the world held its breath. Adolf Hitler, confident in the might of his war machine, launched an ambitious campaign eastward, deep into the heart of the Soviet Union. His target, a city on the Volga River named after the Soviet leader himself, Stalingrad. What began as a strategic move to secure oil fields in the Caucasus would soon escalate into one of history's most brutal and decisive confrontations. This was not just a battle for territory, it was a clash of ideologies, a struggle for survival, and a turning point that would reshape the modern world. The fate of nations would be decided in the rubble of this one city, in a battle that would forever be etched in human memory as a symbol of unimaginable suffering and unbreakable will. The story of Stalingrad doesn't begin on its war-torn streets, but a year earlier, with Operation Barbarossa. In June 1941, Germany unleashed a surprise invasion of the Soviet Union, a blitzkrieg on an unprecedented scale. Millions of German soldiers surged across the border, confident of a swift victory. Initially, their advance was relentless. The Red Army, caught off guard and weakened by internal purges, suffered catastrophic losses. Entire armies were encircled, destroyed. Cities fell one after another: Minsk, Kiev, Smolensk. It seemed as though nothing could stop the German juggernaut. Hitler famously predicted the Soviet state would collapse like a house of cards. But the vastness of the Russian landscape and the onset of its brutal winter began to slow the German advance. The initial momentum stalled just outside Moscow. Far from collapsing, the Soviet Union mobilized its immense industrial and human resources. Factories were dismantled and moved east, beyond the reach of German bombers, where they began churning out tanks, planes, and guns at an astonishing rate. The Soviet people, despite the immense suffering, rallied with a fierce patriotism. Resistance stiffened. What was meant to be a swift campaign bogged down into a grinding war of attrition. By the summer of 1942, Hitler needed a decisive victory to regain the initiative. He turned his attention south. His new plan, Case Blue, aimed to seize the rich oil fields of the Caucasus. And standing directly in the path of this southern advance was Stalingrad. The city was more than just a name on a map. It was a vital industrial hub stretching for miles along the western bank of the mighty Volga River. Its factories produced tanks and artillery, crucial for the Soviet war effort. More importantly, the Volga was a critical transport artery, carrying oil from the Caucasus to the rest of Russia. Capturing Stalingrad would sever this lifeline, crippling the Soviet military and economy. But for Hitler, the city's name held an irresistible symbolic power. To seize the city of Stalin would be a monumental personal and ideological triumph, a humiliation for his arch-rival. For Stalin, the same logic applied in reverse. The city bearing his name could not be allowed to fall. It had to be defended at all costs. Not one step back became the rallying cry. And so, the stage was set. The German Sixth Army, one of the Wehrmacht's most formidable and experienced forces, was tasked with taking the city. As they advanced across the open steppe, they met fierce but crumbling resistance. By late August, they were at the gates of Stalingrad, poised for what they believed would be the final blow. On August 23, 1942, the sky over Stalingrad turned black. The German Luftwaffe unleashed a terrifying aerial bombardment. Wave after wave of bombers descended upon the city, dropping thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiary devices. The air was filled with the deafening roar of engines and the thunder of explosions. Wooden houses evaporated in firestorms that swept through entire districts. Brick buildings were smashed into skeletal ruins. The city's infrastructure, its water mains, power lines, and transport systems was systematically destroyed. In less than 48 hours, Stalingrad was transformed from a bustling industrial center into a smoldering, desolate landscape of rubble and ash. Tens of thousands of civilians perished in the initial onslaught. Trapped in the inferno with no way to escape across the Volga, the Germans believed the city was annihilated, its will to fight broken. They were wrong. The destruction, intended to pave the way for an easy conquest, had unintentionally created the perfect fortress. The Soviets, under the command of General Vasily Chuikov, resolved to turn every ruin into a defensive stronghold, every pile of debris into a sniper's nest. The Red Army soldiers who ferried across the Volga into this hellscape knew they were likely going to their deaths, but they also knew that the ruins gave them an advantage. In this new landscape, the German superiority in tanks and aircraft was neutralized. The battle for Stalingrad was about to become something else entirely, a savage, close-quarters fight in a labyrinth of destruction. The battle descended into what the Germans called Rattenkrieg, Rat War. It was a brutal, intimate form of urban combat fought not for strategic hills or open fields, but for individual rooms, stairwells, and sewer tunnels. Life and death were measured in meters. A single apartment building could change hands a dozen times in a day. Soldiers fought in near-total darkness, navigating treacherous landscapes of shattered concrete, twisted steel, and unexploded ordnance. The lines between friend and foe blurred in the chaos. Snipers became the masters of this domain, their deadly craft defining the rhythm of daily life. A moment of carelessness, a head raised above cover for a second too long, could be fatal. The sounds of war were constant: the crack of a rifle, the chatter of a machine gun from a neighboring ruin, the sudden, violent crump of a grenade, and the screams of the wounded. The fighting was relentless, consuming soldiers on both sides with physical and psychological exhaustion. They fought for cellars, for piles of rubble, for the skeletons of factories that had once been the city's pride. This was no longer conventional warfare, it was a desperate, primal struggle for survival. Fought floor by floor, room by room, in the shattered heart of a dying city. In the sprawling urban battlefield, certain locations became legendary symbols of the struggle. The Red October Steel Factory, the Jasinski tractor plant, and the barricaded gun factory were transformed from centers of production into sprawling, fortified labyrinths. These industrial giants, with their thick concrete walls and complex networks of workshops and tunnels, became fortresses within the city. Soviet defenders, many of them factory workers who had once built tanks here, now used the familiar terrain to wage a deadly defense against the invaders. Another icon of resistance was Pavlov's house. This ordinary four-story apartment building, overlooking a key square, was defended by a small platoon led by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov. For nearly 2 months, this handful of men held out against relentless German attacks, using machine guns, anti-tank rifles, and mortars to repel infantry and armor. They fortified their position, digging communication trenches and laying minefields, turning the building into an impregnable fortress. On German military maps, this single, unassuming building was marked simply as a stronghold. Pavlov's house, along with the giant factories, came to represent the spirit of Stalingrad, the transformation of the ordinary into the extraordinary, and the unyielding determination to hold on, no matter the cost. These names are not just places, they are monuments to human endurance in the face of annihilation. The Battle of Stalingrad was a turning point not just in the war, but in the course of human history. The German Sixth Army was ultimately encircled and annihilated, a devastating blow from which the Nazi regime would never fully recover. The victory came at a staggering cost, with total casualties on both sides estimated to be close to 2 million, making it one of the bloodiest battles ever fought. But beyond the statistics, Stalingrad stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It demonstrates how ordinary people, faced with unimaginable horror, can find the strength to resist and endure. The ruins of the city became a crucible that forged a victory against tyranny. Today, as we look back at the fog-shrouded banks of the Volga, we remember not just the grand strategies and turning points, but the individual courage and sacrifice that define this epic struggle. The story of Stalingrad reminds us that even in the darkest of times, hope can endure, and that the will to defend one's home can become an unstoppable force. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing for more journeys into the past. As September bled into October, the German grip on Stalingrad seemed absolute. They held nearly 90% of the ruined city. For the Soviets, the world had shrunk to a few shattered factory districts and a thin, precarious sliver of land along the western bank of the Volga. It was a strip of hell, barely a few hundred yards deep in some places, constantly raked by German machine guns, mortars, and dive bombers. From here, the defenders could see the eastern bank, a tantalizing glimpse of safety that was, for them, a world away. Yet, retreat was not a word in their vocabulary. Surrender was unthinkable. Every night, under the cloak of darkness and the relentless gaze of German flares, a lifeline pulsed across the frigid waters of the Volga. Ferries, barges, and small fishing boats, crewed by sailors who knew their chances of survival were slim, braved a gauntlet of artillery shells and bombs. They carried not just ammunition and scraps of food, but fresh reinforcements. Thousands of young soldiers ferried from the quiet of the eastern bank into the roaring furnace of the city. Many wouldn't survive their first few hours, but they kept coming. For every soldier that fell, another took his place, stepping over the frozen bodies of his comrades to plug a gap in the line. The 62nd Army was being bled white, but it refused to die. While Chukov's men clawed for every inch of rubble inside the city, a grander strategy was quietly taking shape far from the front lines. The Soviet High Command, Stavka, had been watching the German obsession with Stalingrad with keen interest. Hitler's fixation had created a fatal vulnerability. To protect the overstretched flanks of the Sixth Army, the Germans relied on their Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian allies. These troops were poorly equipped, their morale was low, and they lacked the anti-tank weaponry needed to repel a modern mechanized assault. It was a weakness waiting to be exploited. General Georgy Zhukov, the man who had saved Moscow, now orchestrated a plan of staggering ambition, Operation Uranus. The concept was simple, but its scale was immense. The massive Soviet armies would secretly assemble on the vast, empty steppes to the north and south of Stalingrad. They would not attack the city directly. Instead, they would smash through the weak Axis flanks, drive deep into the German rear, and meet at the town of Kalignano, west of Stalingrad. If it worked, the entire German Sixth Army and parts of the 4th Panzer Army would be trapped in a gigantic pincer movement. On the morning of November 19, 1942, a deafening artillery barrage shattered the winter silence on the northern steppe. A dense, freezing fog had descended, grounding the Luftwaffe and concealing the Soviet advance. Out of the mist, thousands of T-30 for tanks and waves of infantry crashed into the Romanian Third Army. The Romanian lines, brittle and unprepared, simply disintegrated. The next day, the southern pincer struck, tearing through the Romanian Fourth Army. The Soviet tank corps raced across the frozen plains, an armored tide that was now unstoppable. German commanders, stunned by the speed and ferocity of the assault, scrambled to react. But it was too late. Just 4 days after the offensive began on November 23rd, the spearheads of the two Soviet fronts met at Kalik, closing the ring. Inside the newly formed pocket, or Kessel, were over 250,000 Axis soldiers. The hunters had become the hunted. Trapped. The word echoed through the ranks of the Sixth Army with chilling finality. General Paulus, his forces now completely cut off, pleaded with Hitler for permission to break out to the west. A breakout was still possible, but it meant abandoning Stalingrad, a symbolic blow Hitler refused to accept. Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering, head of the Luftwaffe, made a disastrously bold promise. His air force could supply the encircled army entirely from the air. He guaranteed hundreds of tons of supplies per day. It was a fantasy, a fatal miscalculation born of arrogance. As December arrived, so did the full fury of the Russian winter. Temperatures plummeted to minus 30 degrees Celsius, then minus 40. Blizzards swept across the steppe, burying everything in a thick blanket of snow. For the German soldiers, it was a slow, agonizing descent into hell. They were dressed for an autumn campaign, not this Arctic nightmare. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and faces. They huddled in makeshift dugouts, their uniforms frozen solid, their bodies racked with dysentery and typhus. Fuel ran out. Tanks and vehicles became useless, frozen steel monuments to a failed campaign. Food disappeared almost immediately. The daily ration, already meager, was cut again and again until it was just a few ounces of bread made from sawdust. Soldiers boiled leather belts for sustenance and scavenged for the frozen carcasses of horses. Starvation became the true enemy, a silent, force more terrifying than any Soviet soldier. Goering's promised airlift was a catastrophic failure. On a good day, a fraction of the required supplies arrived. On bad days, nothing came at all. Planes crashed in the snow or were shot down by Soviet fighters. The Kessel was not just a military pocket, it was a vast open-air prison of ice and starvation. In late December, a desperate German relief attempt, Operation Winter Storm, was launched from the southwest. For a moment, a flicker of hope ignited among the trapped men. Field Marshal von Manstein's panzer divisions fought their way to within 30 miles of the pocket. Paulus again begged Hitler for permission to break out and link up with the relief force. Again, Hitler refused. The order was to stand fast. The relief force, facing overwhelming Soviet pressure, was forced to retreat. The last hope was extinguished. January 1943. The end was a slow, grinding collapse. The Soviet forces, sensing victory, tightened their grip, launching a final offensive to liquidate the pocket. They sliced the Kessel into smaller and smaller pieces. Resistance, once fanatical, now crumbled into apathy. Entire divisions simply ceased to exist. Their men too weak from hunger and cold to even lift their rifles. The once proud 6th Army was a ghost army, a collection of freezing, starving skeletons wandering through a landscape of ruin. On January 31st, Soviet soldiers entered the basement of the Univermag department store in what was left of central Stalingrad. There, they found General Friedrich Paulus, recently promoted to field marshal by Hitler in a grotesque attempt to compel him to suicide. Paulus chose survival. He surrendered, the first German field marshal in history to be taken captive. Over the next 2 days, the last pockets of resistance flickered out. Of the nearly 300,000 men trapped in the Kessel, only about 90,000 remained to surrender. Of those, fewer than 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The silence that fell over Stalingrad on February 2, 1943, was profound. For 6 months, the city had been the epicenter of the most brutal battle in human history. Now, there was only the wind whistling through the skeletons of buildings. The victory came at an almost unimaginable cost. The Red Army had suffered over 1 million casualties in the Stalingrad sector alone. The city itself was utterly obliterated. But the price paid was not in vain. Stalingrad was more than a military victory, it was a moral one. It shattered the myth of German invincibility and marked the decisive turning point of the war on the Eastern Front. From this point forward, the Wehrmacht would be in retreat, pushed back step by step, all the way to Berlin. The momentum had shifted irrevocably. In the ruins of this one city, a nation's resolve was forged in fire and ice. And the path to victory, however long and bloody, was now clear. The name Stalingrad would forever be etched into history, a testament to unimaginable suffering and indomitable human will.